A terrified German shepherd hides in the corner, trembling at every sound, until the right person arrives. What happens next will break your heart and mend it at the same time. This is a story of fear, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a broken dog and the human who refused to give up on him. If you're an animal lover, hit subscribe for more stories like this. It's completely free, and it inspires us to keep telling the ones that truly matter. The shelter had always smelled of antiseptic and sorrow, the low hum of fluorescent lights doing nothing to soften the chill in the air. Volunteers shuffled from cage to cage, carrying food and hope in equal measure, their footsteps muffled by exhaustion. But in the farthest corner of the facility, in a dimly lit kennel marked with peeling paint, a German shepherd had curled up so tightly that he almost seemed invisible. His fur was matted with dirt, patches of scars peeking through, and his eyes, large, soulful, and haunted, never left the floor. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't even flinch when humans passed nearby. The staff had started calling him Shadow, for the way he seemed to disappear from the world entirely. Shadow had arrived at the shelter after being found abandoned on the side of a desolate road. The finder had described him as wary, trembling, and unwilling to approach anyone, even for food. He had been neglected, perhaps abused, and the emotional scars ran deeper than anyone could see at first glance. Every attempt at coaxing him out of his corner had been met with a silent, guarded refusal. Volunteers who tried to extend a hand were met with averted eyes. Those who offered food watched him shrink further back. He was a ghost in a cage, watching the world pass him by without engaging. One afternoon, the shelter received a call from a man named Lucas, a soft-spoken animal rescuer known for rehabilitating traumatized dogs. He had heard about Shadow and insisted on visiting immediately. When he arrived, he walked slowly through the rows of kennels, his hands in his pockets, speaking to the dogs in a quiet, almost conversational tone. Most dogs wagged their tails or barked with curiosity, but Shadow's gaze remained fixed on the floor. Lucas approached the last kennel with a calm patience, crouched at a respectful distance, and simply observed. Hours passed, and though he didn't try to touch the dog, his presence was steady, non-threatening, and somehow comforting. Over the next few days, Lucas returned. Each visit was carefully orchestrated, a slow walk past the kennel, a soft word, a piece of jerky tossed gently into the corner. Shadow began to notice, to acknowledge, and, very slowly, to consider. It was a delicate balance, too much attention, and he would retreat, too little, and he would never understand that he was safe. The staff watched in awe as the German shepherd, once so withdrawn, started raising his head just enough to meet Lucas's gaze. There was no excitement, no wagging tail, only a cautious acknowledgement that someone might not be a threat. For the first time in months, Shadow's ears perked slightly, just a hint of curiosity shining through the pain. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Shadow had been lying in his usual corner when a loud commotion erupted outside his kennel. A group of children on a field trip had wandered too close, shrieking and laughing, and Shadow's instinct was to retreat. But instead of bolting, he froze, ears back, eyes wide, yet his body remained still. Lucas, standing a few feet away, didn't make a move. He simply knelt down, hands open and low to the ground, his voice steady and calm. "It's okay, Shadow," he whispered. "No one's going to hurt you." In that moment, something inside Shadow shifted. Years of fear and mistrust began to crack ever so slightly. He lifted his snout, sniffed the air cautiously, and allowed Lucas to extend a hand near the edge of the kennel. No sudden movements. No barking. Only the quietest nuzzle of acknowledgement. That small gesture, the first real contact after weeks of fear, was the beginning of a bond that no one at the shelter could have predicted. Shadow's tail, once a limp shadow of what it should have been, twitched ever so slightly. Volunteers who witnessed the moment whispered to one another, tears prickling their eyes. They had seen countless rescues, countless shy dogs, but there was something singular in the way Shadow connected with Lucas, a silent understanding that this man was different, that this man could see the dog beneath the scars. And in that corner, hidden from the chaos of the shelter, a transformation had quietly begun. Shadow wasn't ready to leave the safety of his corner just yet, but for the first time, he allowed hope to enter, fragile and tentative, into his wary heart. Days turned into a week, and Shadow's cautious curiosity began to grow. He no longer flinched at every passing volunteer or at the scrape of a broom across the floor. Lucas maintained his routine, never forcing contact, always speaking softly, his presence a steady anchor in a world Shadow had once found hostile. The other dogs in the shelter noticed the shift too. Whispered growls of approval and wagging tails followed Lucas as he moved from kennel to kennel, but Shadow remained in his corner, watching. Not yet participating, but observing. Shadow's world was still small, confined to the dimly lit space of his kennel. Yet in that small world, a flicker of trust had ignited. The breakthrough came one rainy afternoon. The shelter had been unusually quiet, the storm outside rattling windows and sending shadows across the concrete floors. Shadow had tucked himself into his usual spot, ears flat, eyes on the floor, when a sudden crash of thunder caused him to bolt to the far corner of the kennel. His body pressed against the wall, trembling, eyes wide, as if the storm itself were a predator. Lucas arrived just then, having been called by a staff member. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He knelt at the edge of the kennel, arms resting on his knees, and whispered, "I'm right here, Shadow. I won't let anything hurt you." His voice was calm, unwavering, like a lighthouse in the storm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Shadow inched forward, his gaze flicking toward Lucas. There was fear, yes, but also a glimmer of recognition, an acknowledgement that someone had come for him. Hours passed in silence, punctuated only by the rain's rhythm on the roof. Lucas spoke softly, telling Shadow about the world outside the shelter, about warm beds, long walks, and people who didn't hurt dogs. Shadow listened, tilting his head, ears twitching at the sound of a voice that promised safety. When the storm subsided, he had not moved from his corner, yet he was no longer pressed completely against the wall. His body had relaxed just enough to suggest that he understood, just enough to indicate that trust, fragile and tentative, was beginning to take root. The following morning, Lucas brought something new, a soft blanket, the color of autumn leaves, and a worn tennis ball. He placed the blanket gently inside Shadow's kennel and set the ball nearby. Shadow approached cautiously, sniffing the blanket, circling the ball with one wary paw. He did not touch the ball with his mouth, but he allowed it to be near him. It was progress, small, incremental, but monumental for a dog who had spent so long believing that human hands only brought pain. The shelter staff watched from a distance, holding their breaths, not daring to disturb this delicate moment. Lucas returned each day, building trust not with treats alone, but with patience, presence, and unwavering calm. Shadow began to lift his head more frequently, occasionally making eye contact, sometimes letting out the smallest whine, a sound that was more of a question than a plea. Lucas answered each one, never rushing, never scolding, only speaking in tones that promised safety and understanding. Shadow's movements became more deliberate, less of a flinch at every sudden noise. He was discovering that he could exist in the world without constant fear, that not all humans were predators, and that he could be seen, valued, and loved. Then, on a day bathed in sunlight, the moment arrived. Lucas opened Shadow's kennel and knelt low, holding out the blanket he had placed inside the night before. Shadow hesitated, tail tucked, but his gaze met Lucas's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement that he was ready to take a tiny step forward. Lucas remained still, letting Shadow set the pace. The German shepherd, trembling yet determined, stepped out of his corner and onto the blanket, allowing Lucas to reach forward and gently place a hand on his back. The contact was brief, careful, but it was enough. Shadow's body trembled not with fear, but with the beginnings of trust. He had chosen Lucas, and in doing so, he had chosen hope. The days that followed marked a subtle transformation in Shadow. He still maintained his moments of caution, but now curiosity often overpowered fear. Lucas introduced new routines, short walks around the shelter yard, gentle grooming sessions, and slow, deliberate playtime. Each interaction was guided by Shadow's pace. If he recoiled or froze, Lucas would retreat, speaking softly until the dog relaxed again. Progress was measured in inches rather than strides, yet every small advance felt monumental to those who had witnessed Shadow's journey from terror to tentative trust. One morning, the shelter staff brought in a new volunteer, a woman named Clara. She was experienced with fearful dogs, calm and gentle, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that put animals at ease. Lucas stayed nearby, allowing Shadow to observe from a safe distance. Clara spoke softly to him, tossing a few treats onto the blanket in his kennel. Shadow eyed her suspiciously, but he did not retreat to the far corner. Instead, he inched closer, sniffing at the treats. Lucas could see the change. Shadow was beginning to assess, to judge, not to flee automatically. Clara knelt a few feet away and waited, giving Shadow the space he needed. Slowly, carefully, he stepped toward her, ears pricked, body tense but willing. Clara extended a hand, palm up, and Shadow sniffed it, then took a tentative lick. It was a small gesture, but one loaded with meaning. He was opening himself to the possibility that humans could bring kindness instead of harm. Lucas smiled quietly, understanding that Shadow's trust was expanding beyond a single person. That afternoon, Lucas brought Shadow to a quiet corner of the yard. There was a bench, a soft patch of grass, and sunlight filtering through the leaves. Lucas set the blanket down and waited. Shadow approached slowly, his movements cautious but deliberate. Lucas extended his hand, speaking in his low, soothing voice. Shadow allowed himself to be touched, leaning slightly into the contact. For the first time, his tail lifted from between his legs. It was a tentative gesture, but it signaled something profound, a willingness to engage, to bond, and to trust. The shelter staff observed in awe. Shadow had been one of the most fearful dogs they had ever cared for, a dog who would shrink from any human touch. And now, here he was, sitting calmly beside Lucas, letting his guard down just enough to allow connection. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Lucas and Shadow, but for everyone who had witnessed the power of patience, compassion, and unwavering dedication. Days later, the shelter received a call about a potential adopter, a man named Henry, who had lost his own German Shepherd to illness and was searching for a dog in need. Lucas knew immediately that Shadow might be a fit, but he also knew the challenges that awaited. Shadow's trauma was deep, and new people could easily trigger fear. When Henry arrived, Lucas stayed close but allowed him to approach at Shadow's pace. Shadow remained cautious, ears flat and tail low, yet he did not retreat into his corner. He sniffed Henry's hand, then looked to Lucas for reassurance. Lucas nodded subtly, giving Shadow the silent permission to explore. The first interaction was tense but promising. Henry spoke softly, kneeling to Shadow's level, offering gentle praise and a few treats. Shadow's eyes met Henry's, searching for intent, evaluating safety. Slowly, tentatively, he allowed Henry to touch him, first a paw, then a brief rub along his back. Henry's voice was calm, encouraging, never forceful. Shadow responded with small, deliberate gestures of trust, nosing Henry's hand, leaning slightly into contact, tail twitching with curiosity. By the end of the visit, something remarkable had occurred. Shadow had allowed Henry to walk him around the yard, sniffing and exploring with a confidence that had been absent just days before. Lucas watched quietly, pride swelling in his chest. Shadow was no longer hiding in the corner. He was engaging, connecting, and demonstrating that even the most wounded heart could learn to trust again. The following week, Shadow began spending more time outside his kennel, exploring the shelter grounds with a cautious confidence. Henry continued to visit daily, each session a careful balance of patience and gentle encouragement. Shadow's transformation was gradual but undeniable. He wagged his tail with hesitation, allowed more extended touches, and even offered small playful gestures, like pawing at a ball or nudging Henry for a scratch behind the ears. Every interaction was a delicate negotiation of trust, a reminder that recovery was not linear, but filled with small victories that mattered profoundly. One rainy afternoon, Henry and Lucas sat on the shelter porch, watching Shadow sniff along the wet grass. The storm had chased most of the other dogs indoors, leaving Shadow in a rare moment of solitude. He paused, ears flicking, tail low but relaxed, then suddenly bolted toward the far edge of the yard. Henry jumped to his feet, heart racing. He thought Shadow might be panicking, but Lucas waved him down. Shadow had stopped by an old, neglected tree line, where he crouched low, body trembling, eyes fixed on something unseen. Henry approached slowly, voice calm and low. Shadow did not move, not even as Henry knelt a few feet away. Lucas squatted beside him, whispering, "It's okay, boy. I'm here. You're safe." Shadow's gaze shifted between Lucas and Henry, then returned to the shadows beneath the trees. Slowly, a small whimper escaped him. Henry inched closer, and the source of Shadow's anxiety became clear. A tiny, shivering German Shepherd puppy had wandered into the area, soaked and scared. Shadow's reaction was intense but layered. His body was tense, protective, yet his eyes held curiosity and concern rather than aggression. Henry held out a hand toward the puppy, speaking softly, but Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between Henry and the pup. It was not aggression, it was guardianship. Shadow's past traumas had forged a deep instinct to protect the vulnerable, even as he navigated his own fears. Henry understood immediately. Shadow was showing him the depth of his loyalty and empathy, a side that only emerged when someone or something truly needed protection. Over the next hour, Lucas and Henry carefully guided the puppy closer, Shadow watching intently. Slowly, cautiously, Shadow allowed the pup to approach, sniffing at him with tentative gestures. Shadow's body relaxed slightly, but he remained alert, his gaze flicking between the puppy and the humans nearby. It was a delicate balance, a silent demonstration of trust and responsibility. Shadow's fear had not vanished, but his capacity for empathy, even in the midst of his own trauma, was profound. As the rain eased, the three of them moved toward the shelter building. Shadow led the way, nose low, ears perked, tail still cautious but wagging slightly. The puppy followed, shadowing Shadow's movements as if understanding instinctively that he would be safe in his presence. Henry and Lucas fell and stepped behind them, hearts swelling with a mixture of awe and relief. Shadow had chosen to trust not only Henry but also the newcomer, signaling that he had begun to believe in the possibility of safety and care once more. That evening, as the shelter staff dried the puppy and settled him into a temporary kennel, Shadow lay nearby, vigilant yet calm. He allowed Henry to scratch behind his ears, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. Shadow's journey had been long and painful, but moments like this proved that healing was possible, even for those who had endured profound fear and suffering. Every glance, every small gesture, was a testament to his resilience and the deep connections he was capable of forming. By the time the sun set, Shadow had made a remarkable decision. He curled up on the blanket in his kennel, the puppy resting safely beside him. Henry knelt down, brushing a wet leaf from Shadow's fur. "You're amazing, boy," he whispered. Shadow responded with a soft nudge, eyes closing briefly in trust. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax completely, to be present without fear. Lucas watched from the doorway, silently marveling at the power of patience, compassion, and the unspoken bond that had formed between humans and dog, old and young, traumatized and rescued. The next morning, the shelter was filled with a quiet energy, a mix of anticipation and routine. Shadow was already awake, sitting alert in his kennel, eyes scanning the room. The puppy, now named Ember by the staff, whimpered softly from his temporary crate, looking around with cautious curiosity. Shadow's ears twitched. He glanced toward Henry, then back at Ember, a silent signal that he would watch over the newcomer. Henry knelt beside Shadow, letting his hand rest lightly on the dog's shoulder. "You're doing such a good job, Shadow," he whispered. The dog's eyes met his, filled with trust and a gentle pride, as though acknowledging the compliment without words. As the morning progressed, the shelter staff began their usual rounds, preparing food, cleaning kennels, and welcoming visitors. Shadow remained unusually still, his gaze unwavering, fixated on Ember. When a volunteer tried to open Ember's crate, Shadow stepped forward, placing a paw gently on the edge, blocking the attempt without aggression, just protective insistence. Henry intervened, carefully explaining, "He's watching out for him. Shadow's not being aggressive. He's making sure Ember feels safe." The volunteer stepped back, observing quietly. Shadow's behavior was a remarkable display of instinctual guardianship, a stark contrast to the timidity and fear that had defined him only weeks before. By midday, Henry decided to allow Ember and Shadow more freedom together. With the shelter yard empty of visitors, he opened the connecting gate and watched as Ember tentatively stepped out. Shadow waited a few feet away, tail low but wagging slightly, then moved closer, circling the puppy with slow, deliberate movements. Ember sniffed the ground, then Shadow, testing the waters. Shadow remained calm, matching Ember's pace, occasionally giving a reassuring nudge with his nose. Henry's heart swelled. This was more than socialization. This was a silent mentorship, a fragile trust forming between two traumatized souls. Hours passed, and the bond deepened. Shadow began showing Ember the shelter routine, where to eat, where to rest, and most importantly, how to navigate the world without fear. The puppy mimicked Shadow's every movement, hesitant but willing. Shadow, in turn, seemed to swell with a new sense of purpose, his previous fears overshadowed by the need to protect and guide. Henry observed in quiet awe, realizing that Shadow's trauma had given rise to a profound empathy, one that allowed him to care for another despite his own scars. That evening, a local rescue coordinator visited the shelter, looking for a dog suitable for therapy work with at-risk children. Henry and Lucas guided her to Shadow and Ember's play area. As they watched, Shadow remained close to Ember, watching the visitor carefully, then slowly approached her himself. The coordinator knelt, letting Shadow sniff her hand, and he responded with gentle, deliberate licks. She smiled, noting the dog's calm, protective demeanor. "This one has incredible potential," she whispered, eyes misting. Henry felt a swell of pride. Shadow had come so far, and now his strength and empathy could benefit others beyond the shelter. Later that night, after the last volunteer had left, Henry sat alone with Shadow and Ember in the quiet shelter room. Ember curled up beside Shadow, his small body warm and trusting. Shadow rested his head near the puppy, eyes half closed, finally allowing himself the peace he had denied for so long. Henry stroked his back, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, knowing that this was a victory not just for the dogs, but for everyone who had ever struggled to rebuild trust after trauma. Shadow's journey had been arduous, each step marked by fear, hesitation, and small victories. But with patience, empathy, and unwavering care, he had evolved from a corner-hiding, fearful dog into a guardian and mentor, demonstrating the resilience of spirit and the transformative power of trust. Henry realized that every moment, every gentle touch, every patient interaction had contributed to this miracle, a living testament that healing is possible, even for those who have known profound pain. Shadow, once hidden in fear, had become a beacon of hope, showing the world that even the most scarred souls can shine brightly when met with compassion and love. Morning came with a soft, golden light spilling into the shelter yard. Shadow and Ember were already awake, the pair sitting side by side, a mirror of trust and companionship. The air was calm, almost sacred, as if the shelter itself recognized the quiet triumph that had been achieved. Henry arrived early, carrying a small breakfast for both dogs. He knelt beside Shadow, feeling the warmth of his fur and the steady pulse of life that had once seemed so fragile. "Ready for today, boy?" he whispered. Shadow's ears twitched in acknowledgement, his eyes holding a steady, unwavering trust. Ember wagged his tiny tail, bouncing slightly, mirroring Shadow's calm confidence. The day's first visitor was a young girl, timid but curious, her mother gently encouraging her to approach. Shadow immediately positioned himself between the girl and Ember, an instinctual protector ensuring the girl felt safe while allowing Ember to explore. The puppy, now playful yet still careful, circled around Shadow before approaching the girl slowly. Shadow's eyes never left her, his presence both reassuring and commanding respect. The girl's face lit up as Ember nuzzled her hand, and Shadow offered a soft, approving bark. Henry's heart ached with pride and emotion. The transformation was undeniable. Shadow, once a trembling corner hider, was now a patient, courageous guide, a living testament to resilience and love. Later, the rescue coordinator returned with paperwork to enroll Shadow in a specialized therapy program. As she watched the interactions between Shadow, Ember, and Henry, her eyes softened. "He's remarkable," she murmured, her voice almost reverent. "I can see why he was so hesitant at first. He's been through so much. But look at him now. Look at the way he teaches the puppy, protects the children, and connects with everyone here. He's going to change lives." Shadow, as if sensing the weight of her words, rested his head on Henry's knee, a quiet affirmation of all that had been endured and overcome. By afternoon, the shelter had become a hub of small, quiet miracles. Ember had learned to follow Shadow's lead completely, venturing farther into the yard, exploring new toys, and responding to Henry's gentle commands. Shadow, patient and composed, continued to guide him, occasionally nudging Ember back when he became too bold or uncertain. The bond between the two was unbreakable, forged in trust, patience, and shared experience. Volunteers whispered in awe, noting the almost human-like understanding in Shadow's eyes, the way he seemed to anticipate Ember's fears before they even manifested. As the sun dipped low, painting the yard in warm hues, Henry allowed both dogs a final run before settling them inside. Shadow led Ember to their crate, and the puppy curled beside him without hesitation. Shadow rested his head on Ember's back, eyes half closed, a sentinel finally at peace. Henry watched, a lump in his throat, realizing that the journey had come full circle. The dog who had once cowered in fear now radiated strength, empathy, and calm authority, teaching everyone around him the true meaning of resilience. Night fell, and the shelter quieted. Shadow and Ember lay together, a picture of trust and healing, the shadows of fear long gone. Henry whispered softly, "You've done more than survive, Shadow. You've shown us all what it means to hope, to love, and to forgive." The dogs, a guardian and a student, rested together, embodying the transformative power of compassion. In that silent, golden hour, the shelter seemed to hold its breath, honoring the journey of two souls who had found each other and, through their bond, had healed more than just themselves. In the weeks that followed, Shadow excelled in his therapy training, his calm demeanor and protective instincts making him a perfect candidate to assist children coping with trauma. Ember thrived under his guidance, becoming a confident, playful, and loving dog. Visitors and staff alike were inspired, witnessing firsthand the extraordinary courage and heart of a dog who had once hidden in a corner, too afraid to face the world. Shadow's story spread, touching hearts and changing perceptions, reminding everyone that even the deepest scars can give rise to incredible strength and boundless compassion. The corner that had once been Shadow's prison had transformed into a sanctuary. Through patience, love, and the right human touch, a broken soul had not only healed, but had become a beacon of hope for others. And in every glance between Shadow and Ember, Henry saw a promise kept, a promise of protection, guidance, and the quiet miracles that emerge when fear is met with kindness. Shadow's journey, once shadowed by pain, now shown as a testament to the resilience of spirit and the enduring power of unconditional love.